I don't think they sort of have big stone houses in America. So for them, that's as thick as it gets. This is the three little pigs.
My point,
writ
Manveen,
large.
is if they're not stuck together, they're not going to. Never mind.
It's not substantial, but I think you're right. I think he does quite encourage sort of some of this. He doesn't mind it. It feels like a wrestling match in the White House. But at some point, those splits are going to start to hurt. And I think this might be the moment because he has blinked. In his first administration, the one thing that would really worry him was the state of the markets. They even called it the Trump put. So markets could guarantee that if things started to look bad, he would change his policy because he'd be really embarrassed that the markets were going down. It's the only thing he cared about.
But let's talk about, as everyone is talking about, let's talk about tariffs. After a day in which the US bond market started to go in the wrong direction, continued to go in the wrong direction, President Trump finally announced a 90-day pause on higher tariffs for dozens of countries. But the global trade war is far from over because he also increased levies on Chinese goods to 125%. I think they were already at 104% beforehand. The president said that China would have to come to the table in the end.
China wants to make a deal. They just don't know how quite to go about it. It's one of those things they don't know how quite. They're proud people. And President Xi's a proud man. I know him very well. And they don't know quite how to go about it, but they'll figure it out. They're in the process of figuring it out, but they want to make a deal.
Manveen, I'm just not getting this, because everything I read about this, 2% of China's economy is exports to the United States.
Yeah.
Now, that's a lot, 2% of an economy, but it's only 2%.
Yeah.
And Trump seems to be talking as if we're talking about like 60% of the Chinese economy, 100% of the Chinese economy. And I just think they're just going to ignore him, aren't they?
Yes. I mean, they've already made it quite clear that they're going to fight to the very end. But, the way he set it up, this is a man who prides himself on being an expert in the art of the deal. He set it up as if you want a deal, you need to persuade both parties that it's a win-win. He's setting it up as a win-lose for America because, by saying these are proud people, for them to come to the table would mean that they were sucking up their pride. It means that the rest of us have no pride whatsoever.
Yeah.
He's creating a situation where it's impossible for them to want to be part of a discussion. And I think if you want to understand the Chinese perspective on this, you have to, and I don't think we talk about this enough, but the Chinese government has to be able to explain it to the Chinese people. If you go to school in China, you study history, one of the things that is drilled into you from a very young age is the idea of a century of humiliation and shame at the hands of the West, basically. It went from being this great empire, one of the great civilizations in the world, that was sort of brought to its knees because of the West playing games and basically humiliating it with the Opium Wars.
Yeah.
That is the backdrop. And if you're now telling them they're proud people, they'd better come and capitulate to Donald Trump, of all people, you're basically asking them to enter another humiliating situation. That's not going to happen. How would you convince your people that that was a good move? He hasn't understood China if he thinks that any part of that speech was going to bring them to the table. It won't.
I mean, something actually fascinating you saying that. I remember I think I've been to China twice, but the first time I visited in Beijing, people talking about America. It was in the context of a show they were taking to America. They were sort of performing troupe, but they were fascinated by the idea of America because they didn't really get what it was. They were like, this is a place, this is a place without history where loads of Western people have gone. And the idea of America actually being a country in the same way that China was a country, they're like, well, obviously not. They've only been there 5 minutes. Lara, do you think, did he back down? Is that the way we should look at this?
I mean, it's very clear, especially from reading the Times, that Scott Benston, the Treasury Secretary, had something to do with this and was making it quite clear to the president that there was perhaps some negative consequences or some difficulty to the sheer volume of countries that were trying to bang down the door and get a deal before these tariffs came into place. So it's actually, clearly right now it's very difficult for Keir Starmer because he'll be thinking, okay, well, originally we claimed this was a vindication.
Yep.
Then on Saturday, the Times reported that Starmer thought there were circumstances in which these could be a good thing for the UK. He then wrote an opinion piece for the Times on Monday morning, I think it was, saying, let's be clear, these are not a good thing for the UK. And then yesterday, I think it was, said, yes, there's still going to be some difficult economic impact from this, and is now clearly being candid and has come round to the idea that you have to be more honest about the fact that actually, even if he doesn't want to criticise President Trump directly, he should be quite honest about the fact that there's going to be a difficult economic hit to Britain from this. And obviously, there's been some relief for some in recent hours, but not really for Britain, right? We're still in a very difficult...
Still in the same position.
Still in the same position. In many ways, it's actually undermined our case, because initially, if we were saying we were singled out for generous treatment of merely 10%, and now actually other people are in the same boat, that's hardly helping the position of British politicians who are aiming that we've got this fantastic relationship with the the US, which insulates us from harm. So I think they're in a difficult position, still trying to get the economic deal over the line, and in the meantime have a whole other host of related issues around things like British steel and other kind of industrial questions that they need to figure out. So not easy for Starmer.
But I mean, if the people who are in Trump's cabinet are fighting so hard to rein him in and only just managing it, what hope does Keir Starmer have of engaging with him really on any level at all?
It's such a different way that it feels like the Trump administration engaged with their colleagues to how Starmer would engage with his. Like, I think the Caroline Levitt quote, the press secretary, was "boys will be boys," or something to that manner.
Well, this is about Musk fighting with
fighting with the
Peter Navarro.
Peter Navarro, who we know is a big fan of the tariffs in circumstances where Musk is very much not. And rather than kind of quell any dissent, I mean, in Britain, if somebody disagrees with somebody in cabinet and that gets leaked, it's a very big story. It's a big cabinet row. It elevates what could have just been a simple disagreement into something that becomes a really significant political issue and in many cases a challenge to the Prime Minister's authority. Clearly Trump doesn't feel that way about these rows. Actually, I think he's got to a place where he's saying, and we've seen that as well previously with disagreements between Marco Rubio, for example, and Elon Musk over Doge. This is definitely an administration where Trump wants it to be known that actually, people can disagree with each other and publicly, and to the extent that they're calling each other morons on social media.
He called him Peter Retardo.
I think he said he was thicker than a sack of bricks.
Yes,
which
thicker
is
than a sack of bricks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I love that
nice.
they don't hold back.
Yeah.
But
is a brick's thick?
well, apparently.
I mean, you think if you've got loads of bricks, it's not one giant brick. There's a way through.
I don't think they sort of have big stone houses in America. So for them, that's as thick as it gets. This is the three little
my
pigs.
point,
writ
Manveen,
large.
is if they're not stuck together, they're not going to. Never mind.
It's not substantial, but I think you're right. I think he does quite encourage sort of some of this. He doesn't mind it. It feels like a wrestling match in the White House. But at some point, those splits are going to start to hurt. And I think this might be the moment because he has blinked. In his first administration, the one thing that would really worry him was the state of the markets. They even called it the Trump put. So markets could guarantee that if things started to look bad, he would change his policy because he'd be really embarrassed that the markets were going down. It's the only thing he cared about. And he didn't do it this time for a good week or two. And everyone thought, oh no. Suddenly there is no logic to what he does. And then he had to blink because it wasn't just Elon Musk, but, in his speech, he kept quoting big finance guys. And clearly he was getting a lot of phone calls. A lot of his biggest supporters who were, the billionaires were calling him up and very publicly sort of calling him out on his tariff policy. And I think he just didn't want to be embarrassed by the markets crashing under him.
I would just point out before we just move on a tiny bit that some bricks have holes in them. There's aero bricks. I don't know if you can call them thick. Will gets in touch and says he meant a sack of bricks, as in BRICS, especially given he thought the S in that stood for Spain. The 90-day pause. It's not just that he's bent. It's not just that he's given away. He's so unpredictable. Will there be a 90-day pause? Will there still be a 90-day pause tomorrow? Three months from now, will the pause come? I mean, it's impossible to predict what he'll do. It's not just that what he does seems to have no logic that anyone else can understand who isn't him. It's also that it's not consistent.
Well, also the 90 days, I mean, it basically reassures the markets for a little bit. It gives them 90 days to make hay. But in terms of actual business decisions, so for example, one of the companies that's massively harmed by the Chinese tariffs is Apple. We all know that if you were to make an Apple iPhone in the West, if you were to make it in America, it would now cost more than £3,000 each, which nobody's prepared to pay for. At the moment, an awful lot of their parts are made in China. If there's a 90-day tariff holiday for Vietnam and India, which are the other two countries where they make these parts, are you going to change all your operations? No.
Well, why would you?
Why would you start building a bigger plant in either of those countries? Because you don't know what happens at the end of the 90 days. You can't make long-term business decisions on tiny windows like that. There is no certainty, and that's no way to run an economy.
Laura, this leaves the government here they're already in a difficult financial position, but in an increasingly difficult financial position, an unpredictable financial position. Rachel Reeves is still facing pressure from Labour MPs to change her fiscal rules. Starmer's saying they're not going to change. Are we on the edge of a a different kind of economic situation in the UK?
Well, I think the question of any tariffs at all, we heard during the spring statement where Rachel Reeves obviously rose to deliver that pretty bleak forecast from the Office of Budget Responsibility. Even before any tariffs, there was the possibility that Reeves would have to come back for further tax rises or spending cuts in the autumn budget. So the fact that we've got 10% tariff, really that already enough, in addition to that on steel, aluminium and cars, has made it look pretty likely that she's going to be in for some very difficult decisions come the autumn. Now, both she and Starmer are very, very keen to say their fiscal rules are non-negotiable, and they say this time and time and time again. It would be really staggering if they were to change them. You have seen politicians before say these are exceptional circumstances, we're doing something exceptional, and clearly if the uncertainty continues, like you say, if it is part of the Trump playbook and it remains so until the autumn, then perhaps there would be some wiggle room, but I think it'd be much more likely that you would see them go for something like tax rises or spending cuts in that instance. Their key aim now will be to get an economic deal over the line with the US. Their also second aim will, of course, be to get a deal with the EU over the line. We have a summit on May the 19th. They'll be hoping that they can get a veterinary agreement. They'll be hoping they can get a security pact. There are some issues around that too, but clearly there are questions about whether or not these things can help them towards some sort of solution where they're able to say to voters, look, we're doing what we can. The number of times you guys will have heard cool and collected being spoken by a minister on the airwaves in the last few days is actually quite nauseating. But indeed, that is their line, and it's a line of everybody that you speak to privately. They think we're projecting a sense of great calm magnanimity in the face of this.
We're going to make hot-headed panicked decisions because that's what Britain voted for. Look, Adam gets in touch to remind us that Dominic Cummings called David Davis thick as mince. I think bricks are thicker than mince.
They sound like
Depends
they
on
would
the size
be.
of the brick. It's just Lego. Anyway, coming up, Manveen Rana and Laura Spirit will try and make sense of, among other things, my column, which combines false rumours about Trump's tariffs with fake news about wolves being brought back from extinction.